Charles Lucky Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania, November 24, 1897, was instrumental in creating the American Mafia as we know it today. After graduating from the gritty street gangs of New York, Luciano went on to become a henchman for the American branch of the infamous Cosa Nostra. A criminal mastermind, it was Luciano who orchestrated the unification of warring mob factions, creating the first organized crime commission. In addition to taking on the mantle of the first kingpin of the modern Genovese crime family, he and his mob associates launched the highly successful and lucrative National Crime Syndicate. Luciano's family immigrated to the United States in 1906. His criminal career began not long after. At the age of 10, he was charged with his first crime, shoplifting. Luciano launched his first racket in 1907, charging Jewish and Italian kids in his Lower East Side neighborhood anything from 1 or 2 pennies to as much as a dime for his protection to and from school. If they refused to pay, Luciano beat them up rather than protect them. One of the kids, Meyer Lansky, refused to ante up. After Luciano failed to pound Lansky to a pulp, the two became friends and joined forces in the protection scheme. They remained friends and close associates throughout most of their lives. At the age of 14, Luciano dropped out of school and started a $7 per week delivery job, but after winning more than $200 in a craps game, he realized there were faster and easier ways of earning money. His parents sent him to the Brooklyn Truant School in hopes of straightening him out, but in 1916, after his release, Luciano took over as leader of the notorious 5 Points Gang, where he became acquainted with future mafia leaders Vito Genovese and Frank Costello. In the years leading up to World War I, Luciano expanded his criminal enterprises to include pimping and drug trafficking, and while the police named him as a suspect in several local murders, he was never indicted. By 1920, Luciano had branched out into bootlegging and illegal gambling. With financing and an education in social skills from his mentor, Arnold the Brain Rothstein, initially recruited as a gunman, as time went on, Luciano came to despise the old mafia, Cosa Nostra traditions, and especially Masseria's belief that non-Sicilians could not be trusted, which ironically turned out to be true in Luciano's case. After being kidnapped and mugged, Luciano discovered Joe the Boss was behind the attack. A few months later, he decided to betray Masseria by covertly joining forces with the second largest mafia clan led by Salvatore Maranzano. The Castellamarese War began in 1928, and over the next 2 years, several gangsters connected to Masseria and Maranzana were killed. Luciano, who was still working for both camps, led 4 men, including Bugsy Siegel, to a meeting he had arranged with Masseria. The 4 men sprayed his former boss with bullets, killing him. After the death of Masseria, Maranzano became the boss of bosses in New York, but his ultimate goal was to become the leading boss in the United States. Maranzano appointed Lucky Luciano as his number 2 man. The working relationship was short-lived, however. After learning of a plan by Maranzano to double-cross him and wipe out Al Capone in the bargain, Luciano decided to strike first, organizing a meeting at which Maranzano was killed. Lucky Luciano became the boss of New York, and almost overnight, he began moving into more rackets and expanding their power. The 1930s were prosperous times for Luciano, who was now able to break ethnic barriers formerly laid out by the old mafia. He strengthened his outreach in the areas of bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, and labor rackets. In 1936, Luciano was convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution, pandering, and drug trafficking. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years, but maintained control of the syndicate while behind bars. In the early 1940s, at the onset of America's involvement in World War II, Luciano struck a deal with the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence. He offered to supply information to help protect the mob-run New York docks from Nazi saboteurs in exchange for a move to a better prison and the possibility of early parole. Luciano was transferred to Great Meadow Correctional Facility from the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora in upstate New York. He continued his collaboration, known as Operation Underworld, for the remaining years of the war. In 1946, Governor Thomas E. Dewey, who while serving as special prosecutor was responsible for Luciano's conviction, granted the mobster a commutation of sentence and had him deported to Italy, where he was able to resume control over the American Syndicate. Luciano snuck into Cuba in October 1946, where he attended the Havana Conference, a meeting of the 5 major crime families hosted by Lansky, who already had an established presence in Cuba. The cover for the meeting was an appearance by Frank Sinatra. During the week-long conference that focused on the heroin trade and gambling activities in Cuba, and also on deciding the fate of Bugsy Siegel and his Las Vegas money pit, the Flamingo Hotel, Luciano met privately with Genovese, who suggested that Luciano take on a figurehead role as boss of bosses, while allowing Genovese to control the day-to-day activities of the syndicate. Luciano declined, saying, "There is no boss of bosses. I turned it down in front of everybody. If I ever change my mind, I will take the title, but it won't be up to you. Right now you work for me, and I ain't in the mood to retire. Don't you ever let me hear this again, or I'll lose my temper." When the US government got wind of Luciano's presence in Cuba, it quickly moved to have him repatriated to Italy, where he remained for the rest of his life.